Your full US RDA of iron on this 21st episode of Good Intentions. I'd like to say this episode of Good Intentions offers a brief respite from the onslaught of Donkey Kong and Mario games that hit the NES when it went nationwide in the middle of 1986. But I'm afraid that would be a lie. No, this game doesn't star either of Nintendo's leading men from the arcade's golden era, but nevertheless, Popeye's history is bound inextricably to that of Donkey Kong. Like a lot of Japanese kids growing up in the post-World War II Reconstruction era of Japan, Donkey Kong and Popeye designer Shigeru Miyamoto watched a lot of cartoons. It's not that he necessarily had any particular love for US pop culture that I'm aware of, though he does love the decidedly American bluegrass music genre. It's simply that the US latched onto film and television early and immediately became the world's biggest exporter of moving pictures. Nintendo itself had attempted to capitalize on the popularity of Western cartoons during the 60s, locking down a valuable license for Mickey Mouse and related characters for a while. Japanese animation trickled to the West in those days too, through the likes of Speed Racer, but there was a far larger flow of media gushing in the other direction back then. So, when Miyamoto sat down to design Donkey Kong, maybe it should be no surprise that his original thought was to build the game around a Western cartoon property, none other than E.C. Seeger's cartoon classic Popeye. You know, the sailor man who's strong to the finish 'cause he eats a spinach. Granted, it wasn't entirely Miyamoto's personal whim that led to the Popeye idea. At the time of Donkey Kong's development, Nintendo was in the process of working out an agreement with King Feature Syndicate for Popeye. The timing evidently didn't work out on the arcade game deal, however. Donkey Kong hit the arcades in July 1981, and Nintendo released a completely unrelated Popeye Game & Watch unit the following month. So it seems to have been a near miss. You can definitely see Popeye's influence in Donkey Kong. Sure, it gives a King Kong vibe with a giant ape carrying his dainty abductee up to the top of a skyscraper, but it's not hard to imagine the same scenario with Popeye characters inserted. Replace hammers with spinach and you basically have a classic Popeye cartoon. After all, the perilous under-construction skeletons of those newfangled skyscrapers were a popular theme in many American cartoons throughout the first half and middle of the 20th century. But it didn't work out, and Miyamoto had to come up with his own cast of characters for the game, landing eventually on Donkey Kong and Mario. It's hard to overstate what a lucky break this turned out to be for Nintendo. Had Donkey Kong starred Popeye, it might actually have been an even greater success than Donkey Kong. And that game already holds acclaim for being one of the most popular and profitable arcade games ever. But it also would have meant that Nintendo's foundational video game success would have been owned in part by King Feature Syndicate, and Nintendo might never have created gaming's two most enduring characters. There's already pretty good evidence that the code for Donkey Kong is owned by someone other than Nintendo. Imagine if the game's characters were as well. Miyamoto did eventually have his chance to design a game around Popeye, hence this episode, but we haven't seen a Nintendo-issued version of that Popeye game since the NES version covered here went out of production. The rights to Popeye eventually reverted and ended up with Sigma, publisher that squandered it on a pretty lousy throwback of a Game Boy game that was so mediocre they didn't even bother bringing it to the US where Popeye originated, as revealed in Game Boy World Episode 51. So imagine this alternate scenario. Nintendo makes it big with Popeye, the arcade game in 1981. Mario and Donkey Kong never exist. Ikegame Sushinki holds a claim to the arcade game's code. King Feature Syndicate holds the right to the heroes. Where would that leave Nintendo? Chances are pretty good the company would have gone on to make lots of great and even influential games. But without the breakout characters of Mario and Donkey Kong to hang them on, would the company have seen anywhere near the same degree of self-reliant success that has carried them through the decades? It's an interesting thought exercise, at least, considering Nintendo no longer even appears to have any rights to this Popeye game. The last time we saw it was a few years back in a mobile remake by Bandai Namco. Video game history probably would have turned out quite differently without Donkey Kong. So it's probably just as well for Nintendo that when they finally did get to make a Popeye arcade game, they were left working with the lesser scraps of post-Donkey Kong platformer concepts. Popeye is totally fine and serviceable, but Miyamoto's best ideas definitely went toward Nintendo's own endemic property. The best thing Nintendo's Popeye has going for it is definitely its graphics. Look at these sprites. They're amazing, huge, and perfectly faithful to the cartoon characters. No other game in 1983 so perfectly captured the look of an animated cartoon, unless you count Dragon Slayer, which was not really much of a game. Popeye isn't as interesting to play as Donkey Kong, but it's definitely no Laserdisc game. Unfortunately, some of that appeal is lost in the game's conversion to NES. This was one of the 3 launch titles for the Japanese family computer, along with Donkey Kong and its sequel, and unfortunately, it comes across the most poorly of the 3 on console. That's perhaps to be expected. The NES hardware was basically designed to support Donkey Kong, so of course it looked good, and Donkey Kong Jr. worked with similar assets. On the other hand, Popeye's big chunky arcade sprites appear to have been beyond the specs of the Famicom, at least on day one, perhaps due to cartridge storage limitations, or simply because they required a little more oomph than the hardware could provide without mapper chips. It all plays pretty accurately though. It includes all 3 levels of the arcade game, pretty much all the tricks and gimmicks, and the same general difficulty balance. In terms of design, Popeye actually feels a little bit like a step backward from Donkey Kong, despite its later arrival date. The big invention Donkey Kong offered was the concept of platforming, of a hero who could run and jump so nimbly. Popeye walks it back a bit, replacing the jump button with a punch button. While it probably does make more sense for Popeye to punch than to leap about, this has a direct impact on how the game plays. It makes Popeye feel more in line with games like pre-Donkey Kong platformers such as Space Panic, or derivative works like Kangaroo and Burger Time. The point becomes not to navigate space and take perilous actions in an attempt to reach a spatial objective, but rather to work within fixed boundaries to meet a performance goal. In other words, you're not trying to make it from point A to point B. You're simply roaming a closed-in space until you meet the requirements to advance to a new stage. It's a subtle difference, I suppose, but it feels more like a standard clear-the-board style game than Donkey Kong, which gave the impression of a journey as you struggled time and again to reach Pauline only to have Donkey Kong drag her away to the next level. Here, you can't actually physically reach Olive Oil until the very end. Instead, your task is to gather all the tokens she drops into the playing field before they fall off the screen, while avoiding bad guys. In the first loop of the game, at least in A mode, the only bad guy you really need to worry about is Brutus, who roams the stages attempting to clobber Popeye. Brutus is definitely the best thing about this Popeye game, a moving, fully animated bad guy almost as big as Donkey Kong in terms of pixels, who creates a zone of danger that extends in all directions. Brutus breaks the rules of platform gaming in a sense. He has the ability to leap up or reach down across floors of the screen to harass players, violating the sense of safety typically created by the boundaries of platformers. It's not simply enough to avoid wandering into Brutus when you're both on the same floors, you also need to be aware of his position relative to yours when you're on different stages. If he's too far above you, he'll even jump down from one level to the next to close the gap. So despite this being a one-on-one challenge for the most part, Brutus greatly outmatches Popeye in terms of abilities and strength. He mostly patrols the center of the screen, but this makes him dangerous because your task involves snatching falling objects that flutter haphazardly through the same center areas of the screen. And since this is a score-based game, you're encouraged to take risks. The higher you are on the screen when you collect the object's olive oil drops, the more points you're rewarded with. Sure, you can linger around the bottom of the screen and collect them at the last second, which is actually pretty easy, but you won't earn many points that way. Fortunately, you do have a tricks to help push back against Brutus's threats. In each stage, a can of spinach cycles along the edges of the screen. Grab it and you'll become temporarily invincible, causing Brutus to flee, and if you can bump into him while empowered, he'll go flying off the screen and be forced to respawn, giving you a few precious seconds of breathing room. Spinach also causes the collectibles to freeze in place, meaning it can buy you a second sort of respite if one of those little hearts is about to slip beneath the waves. So it can be handy in any case. You also have a second boon in the form of a bucket suspended at the top of the first stage. If you clobber the punching bag at the upper right of the screen, it'll fly forward and knock the bucket loose. Manage to drop that on Brutus's head, and he'll become momentarily harmless as he flails blindly. Once you've collected enough of Olive's tokens, you advance to the next stage. You begin in a seaside village, advance to a city, and finally reach a boat where Olive has been trapped on the upper masts. Each stage presents you with a very slightly different objective. In level 1, you're collecting enough hearts to fill the house next to Olive, while stage 2 has you gathering musical notes until you fill a staff. The third stage is really the only one that actually integrates the idea of collecting with the idea of rescuing Olive. As you collect the letters H-E-L-P, you slowly build a ladder that leads to the upper mast. Once you've completed all 3 stages, the game loops, a little harder than before. The swooping buzzards appear more frequently, and Brutus is joined by the Sea Hag, an old woman who flings bottles at Popeye from off-screen. And so it goes, becoming harder by presenting you with ever more distractions until you can no longer keep up and you run out of lives. A pretty decent arcade game, but not entirely amazing, especially on NES, where it loses much of its visual appeal. As with Donkey Kong Jr., Popeye also provided the raw materials for an educational game, though Popeye no Eigo Asobi only ever launched in Japan. The idea of Popeye as an English tutor might seem strange, But since you're constantly spelling the word help in the final level of the arcade game, there's at least more of a connection here than there was between Donkey Kong Jr. and math. Again, this Popeye game has never appeared on any other Nintendo system besides NES, including Virtual Console. I can't imagine Nintendo ever bothering to pony up to renew the license, so if you want to play the game, you'll need to track down an NES cart. Thankfully, Nintendo produced plenty of them, so as long as you're not after a complete in-box copy, you won't need to shell out much for the privilege. But really, it's a game that is less interesting for what it is than for what it isn't. Next time on Good Intentions, shock of shocks, another Mario game.